Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. This is the lecture on the Holodomor from the reading called Genocide, A World History by the author Norman M. Naimark. Originally published by Oxford University Press in 2017. That's just the spelling of Norman Naimark on the screen. Okay, I'm going to scroll down to the main part of the reading, Communist Genocide. This is chapter 6. The 1984 Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of Genocide, the foundational legal document defining genocide, limited the categories of its victims to national, ethnic, religious, or racial groups. Attempts to include social and political groups in the convention were defeated in a good part because of the opposition of the Soviet delegation to the United Nations, which worried that its repression of social and political groups at home might be considered genocidal. Since that time, it has been difficult to think about genocide as a crime against a social or political group, or for that matter, other identifiable groups of co-nationals, for example, homosexuals or handicapped people in the case of the Nazis. The significance of this section relates to, does the Holodomor qualify as a genocide? Is there enough evidence to show that it meets the criteria of national, ethnic, religious, or racial groups being targeted? Some questions the author raises is, how does one think in comparative terms about the campaigns of Stalin against the kulaks, allegedly rich Ukrainian farmers, political opponents, Ukrainian peasants, and socially harmful people? The answer suggested here is to apply the category of communist genocide to understand these events. Alternatively, some historians and authors will argue that the kulaks and the Ukrainian peasants were also targeted because of their Ukrainian nationality and culture. Beginning in May 1922, Vladimir Lenin, the leader of the Bolshevik Revolution and the ruler of Russia, suffered a series of strokes that left him incapacitated, and he finally died January 1924. Joseph Stalin, a gifted political infighter and convincing party comrade, managed to outmaneuver the other members of the Politburo, including the brilliant, if politically inept, Trotsky, and seize control of the destiny of the Bolshevik Party. To summarize this section, Stalin was ruthless. Stalin's violence against the Soviet people took the form of fierce retribution for the lack of understanding of and opposition to the wisdom of his policies. The failures of collectivization were blamed on the kulaks, a group of purportedly rich peasants, also Ukrainian, who supposedly exploited the poor and sabotaged collectivization campaign. Kulaks were identified as the class enemy and discontented peasants. Rich or poor, rural clergy, and other village denizens who opposed collectivization were included in this category. Okay, here's a quote. "We will exile the kulak by the thousands and when necessary shoot the kulak breed." And the use of breed would tie into national, cultural, and racial groups more than just an economic group. Gangs of party members, rural, poor, and local thugs attacked and brutalized alleged kulaks. An OGP reported noted, "These people drove the dekulakized naked in the streets, beat them, organized drinking bouts in their houses, shot over their heads, forced them to dig their own graves, undressed women and searched them, stole valuables, money, etc. Some 30,000 kulaks were shot, while as many as 10 million were forced from their homes, perhaps 2 million of those sent into exile." The significance of this section shows a lot of characteristics that are consistent with the definition and understanding of genocide. Here is another quote that supports the definition of genocide. "For Soviet officials, the social category of kulaks took on hereditary and even racial characteristics. And because racial groups are one of the protected groups, that could be an argument for including this as a genocide." This was, wrote Alexander Scholzen, "the essence of Stalin's plan. The peasant seed must perish together with the adults." In official denunciations, kulaks were labeled enemies of the people. They were also dehumanized as swine, dogs, and cockroaches. They were scum, vermin, and filth to be cleansed, crushed, and eliminated. This gives evidence to following the dehumanization stage, which shows characteristics consistent with genocide. Also, the racial characteristics in this paragraph are an important part to quote. The author here says, when Stalin said he wanted to wipe out the kulaks as a class, he meant it literally. The special settlements to which they were exiled were poorly provisioned, if at all. Materials for housing were scarce, medical assistance was lacking, the cold penetrated everywhere, escape often meant death. Many tens of thousands of kulaks died from hunger, exposure, and disease in exile. In January 1932, the OGPU estimated that close to 500,000 kulaks, roughly 30% of the kulak deportees at that time, had either died or run away. The countryside deteriorated badly as a consequence of the dekulakization campaign and forced collectivization. Yet the government's demands for grain and procurement did not slacken. The basic idea was to sell the grain abroad to raise capital necessary for the expansion of industry according to the first 5-year plan. So, some of the significances here is the 5-year plan had some goals for industry and collectivization, which conflicted with the culture of the Ukrainian peasants. And therefore, this plan, Stalin's plan, was at odds with the Ukrainian peasants. As severe shortages of grain appeared in the countryside and the peasants kept their grain for their own consumption, the authorities responded with draconian measures, including confiscating seed grain. So there's an argument here in this section to note. One here is the famine in Ukraine was particularly severe, and the policies targeted Ukraine. However, the counter-argument is that there was a famine all over the Soviet Union. Part of the problem was that Ukrainian peasants were stalwarts opponents of collectivization, successfully resisting requisition in every possible way. This aroused Stalin's ire and led to especially harsh policies carried out against entire subregions and designated villages of Ukraine. Added to the dangerous genocidal mixture was Stalin's animus towards Ukrainian national consciousness, which the Soviet leadership attributed to the backwardness of Ukrainian peasantry. Okay, so this is a key ideology here to note in this section, the paragraph, the idea of nationalism and Stalin's opposition to Ukrainian nationalism. So here's where this concept called nationalism comes into this writing, and a national group is a protected group in the definition of genocide. And so if you could make an argument that Ukrainian national consciousness is being targeted, you could make an argument that this is indeed a genocide, meeting the definition of genocide, based on Ukrainians being a national group. Another key thing to note is Stalin changed the policies of the 1920s. In the 1920s, Soviet policies of indigenization had encouraged Ukrainians to pursue their college, language, and distinctive historical background as a way to promote integration of revolutionary Ukraine into a new union of Soviet socialist republics. But Stalin and his lieutenants came to the realization in the beginning of the 1930s that this policy had created serious obstacles to Kremlin's control of the republic and their ability to dictate social and economic policies as they saw fit. While Soviet leaders did not completely drop indigenization, they now made efforts to gut the policy of serious political consequences. The grain crisis in the Ukrainian countryside overlapped with Stalin's intent to deprive Ukrainians of their ability to function as an independent entity. The Kremlin ignored the death agony of the Ukrainian countryside as millions of peasants suffered from hunger and disease. The horrible fate of death by starvation was a central human fact of the Holodomor, the killer famine, as Ukrainians call it, the report of people going mad with hunger and engaging in cannibalism. The word Holodomor could be translated killer famine, terror famine, death by hunger, so there's lots of possible ways to translate Holodomor. Now, this paragraph here, or this sentence, has some evidence of genocidal intent if you're trying to make an argument of both intent and meeting the definition of genocide. This sentence reads, the Ukrainians lost all hope. The famine was not recognized as such, not recognized as a famine, that means. The government turned down all offers of relief from abroad as unnecessary. So, if a government is experiencing a famine in their country, but they do not want relief, that would suggest that the purpose of the famine may be to kill people. Now the author writes here, the horrors that ensued in the Ukrainian countryside, the Holodomor, should be considered genocide. Okay, so this paragraph is a very important paragraph because now the author is making a statement here that's an opinion that the Holodomor should be considered a genocide, should being an opinion word. So let's pay very close attention to this paragraph. Stalin was out to demolish the Ukrainian peasants. So we got this word Ukrainian, which is a national cultural group, whom he saw as the background of Ukrainian consciousness. This would be a sense of nationalism. He could not starve them all to death. There was simply too much Ukrainian land that needed farmhands to plant and sow. But he could break the back of Ukrainian resistance by reducing the peasantry to a whimpering mass of starving, dying humanity. This he did without the least sense of regret or second thoughts. The author continues, Stalin's attack on the Ukrainian peasantry shared some of the characteristics of Stalin's genocidal policies towards Poles and German, among other nationalities in the Soviet Union during the 1930s and early 1940s. So again, another argument would be characteristics similar to other genocidal policies. Okay, so this paragraph is about all the other groups in the Soviet Union that were targeted by Stalin, including Poles, Germans, Chechens, and the Crimean Tatars. The Crimean Tatars, out of the 189,000 who were deported and who, like the Chechens and English, were taken in an overnight operation from their homeland in the Crimea to the inhospitable and alien land reaches of Central Asia. This is interesting to note because, of course, Crimea has been in the news in recent current events over the last several years. The Great Terror of 1937 to 38 is hard to classify as a genocide because ethnic, national, racial, or religious, or even self-identified social and political groups were not attacked as such. This is where the author is including a counter-argument to show how somebody might make an argument that it's not a genocide by showing that there's a focus on political opponents. So this would be something to quote if you were trying to look at making the opposite argument that the Holodomor was not a genocide in this section. So the author is presenting both points of views in different paragraphs. So as we're coming up to the conclusion, there's three terms here in this section that you should be aware of: Gulag, Khrushchev, and de-Stalinization. Okay, let's take a look at this last little bit of the reading that we're going to take a look at today. Hundreds of thousands more disappeared into a system of prison, special settlements, and forced labor camps of the Gulag system. So you should be aware of the Gulag system, typically associated with Siberia, and a euphemism might be sending people north. Next paragraph. Stalin died March 1953, and his successor Nikita Khrushchev introduced a wave of de-Stalinization in his secret speech of February 25, 1956, which he condemned the dictator's crimes and his cult of personality. Now, there was a reaction all over the communist world where many people considered Stalin to be a hero, and there were monuments and statues of Stalin and pictures and paintings of Stalin and posters. And so this was a major moment in time, a pivotal moment with de-Stalinization to recognize that Stalin had committed crimes against humanity. But uprisings in Eastern Europe in 1956, provoked in part by Khrushchev's speech and the sharpness of internal Chinese criticism, strike movements, and student protests, convinced him that he had to change course in mid-1957, when he launched an anti-rightist campaign that effectively closed down all overt opposition to the regime. Meanwhile, Khrushchev's statements about moving the Soviet Union into the final stage of communism and surpassing the United States in steel production seemed to inspire Mao to even more radical goals. So, just to review, you should be aware about Stalin and Stalinism, the term communism, socialism, and capitalism, nationalism. You should also be aware of synonyms to capitalism, like, let's see, a synonym to capitalism would be free market economy, neoliberalism, classic liberalism. And you should be also aware about the opposite of totalitarianism, which would be, say, liberalism in a different sense. So liberalism would be the freedom of people, where classic liberalism and neoliberalism would be the freedom of business and the economy, where totalitarianism is nobody gets freedom and the state has total control. And Stalinism, of course, incorporated both communism and totalitarianism together, which created some of the problems of the Soviet Union during Stalinism. Advanced students should also consider Googling some of the other terms related to socialism to understand social democracy and democratic socialism, or social democracy, social democracy and democratic socialism would be two to understand. But that's sort of enrichment for students who want to extend their learning to understand socialism and its nuances more completely between the classical definition and the modern usage. So, for example, in modern 21st century, Bernie Sanders may use the word socialism in one way, where the naming of the Soviet Union has the word socialism in its name, and it's used in a different meaning and intent than the way Bernie Sanders would use it today. All right, if you have any questions, send me an email or send me a message on chat. Make sure you also look at the other video about the PowerPoint on the Holodomor, which includes some ideologies. And make sure to Google on Encyclopedia Britannica some of the definitions of the ideologies to clarify your understanding of all the related ideologies. Just to go over the ideologies again that you need to make sure you understand is you should be able to explain communism, you should be able to explain capitalism, you should be able to explain socialism, you should have an understanding of nationalism, specifically Ukrainian nationalism, and the fact that Stalin was opposed to Ukrainian nationalism and national identity. You should be able to understand totalitarianism is really important for the time period of Stalinism, where Stalin wanted total control over his opposition. And when we come to the Khmer Rouge and the story of Cambodia, totalitarianism will come back again. So it's important to understand that concept. All right. Have a good night. Don't forget, if you found this helpful, like and subscribe.